situation. I'm in a relationship. You know what that means.
Or whatever I gotta do, I just can see myself being with you forever.
That's really beautiful.
All right, everybody. Thank you for coming today. We will get started as people kind of start to trickle in a little bit. I'm Katrina Fid. I'm the Communications and Digital Strategy Manager at Chicago Votes. And I'm going to be leading this training to give you guys some tools into how to organize digitally and feel confident in mobilizing people primarily through social media and then other platforms on the internet. Before I start, I'm going to drop in the chat. Not that. Sorry. 1 second. I'm going to drop in the chat some documents and tools that you guys will have access to and that you can use in your own work. Okay. So you all should be able to access all of those documents I dropped, and throughout the training, I will reference them and like pull them up. But those are just the links so that you have access to them. Okay. So just so people know as well, this training is being recorded and live streamed to YouTube. So if you don't feel comfortable with your face on the camera or your name, you can turn your camera off and then like change your name and like erase it if you don't feel comfortable. Sweet. So we will just get started and dive right in. So as I had said, this training is all about digital organizing. And digital organizing, some people are like, what the heck is that? And how is that different from either like posting on social media or just like organizing in the traditional sense that we think about it. So this is really going to break that down for you all, and hopefully people will have a better understanding when they walk away. But first, in order to understand digital organizing, we have to understand what the broader idea of organizing is. So organizing in general is turning personal troubles into public issues. At Chicago Votes, a lot of the organizing we do is around barriers young people face to engaging in democracy. So a personal trouble could be not having an ID and feeling like you can't register to vote because you don't have your ID or a driver's license. And when that's happening to a number of people and you start to see patterns, then it becomes a public issue. And organizing has to be done around it, whether it's a public education campaign or some policy done to change like ID laws for voting. So there's a ton of different types of organizing. There's community-based organizing, labor organizing, electoral organizing, legislative organizing, and so much more. At Chicago Votes, we do community-based organizing, electoral organizing somewhat, and then legislative organizing. And something to really like understand is that, sorry, I have to check the chat here. To understand is that being convincing is not enough to organize. Like just simply talking and having like good arguments is not organizing. Having good arguments is a part of organizing, but that's just one of the many things you have to do. And in the words of Miriam Kaba, she did a podcast on digital organizing. So if you like search Miriam Kaba digital organizing, you should check that out afterwards. But she explained that digital organizing reaches far more people than direct action, just because we live in such a digital world and everybody is constantly tuned in, and that's how many of us receive our information. And that's many of our first points of contact into organizing. When organizing, in general, like for any type of organizing and digital organizing, there's an arc that you kind of follow that helps you understand like your pathway to solving your problem. So first, you want to identify your problem. What is the specific problem you're trying to solve? And being specific is super important, and the amount of specificity varies depending on the organizing you're doing. Then you want to identify who are your allies. So who are the people that maybe have been organizing around this issue in the past? Who are the people that are in support of this issue generally? Are the people that maybe just lack information, but when given the information, they would definitely be in support. And then that kind of also leads us to who has the power to solve this problem. So depending on the type of organizing you're doing, whether it be, for example, like legislative organizing, the people that have the power to solve the problem are, one, the constituents, because they have power over the elected official. And then ultimately it's the lawmakers and legislators that have the power, and then like the governor. So you want to identify who has the problem or who has the power. You also, it's not listed in this arc, but when you're talking about who your allies are, you also want to know who's in opposition. And addressing the opposition depends on your strategy, but just knowing who your opposition is and the arguments against the specific problem you're trying to address is super important, especially when you develop your messaging down the line. But then you want to realize, like, how do you get to the people with power? In terms of like organizing legislatively or in electoral politics, it can feel like there are a ton of barriers between you and the person that actually has the final say over the issue. So you kind of have to figure out like what issues do they care about? What like alliances and things do they have? And then like, how can I use that to my advantage when developing my strategy? And then the final step is creating your plan of action. So once you've been able to identify all these things and like list out these things, you will have a clearer sense of exactly what you need to do to solve your problem. And Miriam Kaba defines power as the ability to make your target meet your demands. So that is something super important in organizing, is because wherever there's people, there's power, and you just have to figure out how to use the resources you have to make your target meet your demands. I also want this like training to be like interactive, and I want people to feel free to speak up, like whether it be unmuting yourself or dropping things in the chat. Speaking up through unmuting yourself is easier for me to see. But if you all have any questions or comments on this, like the arc and things to consider, feel free to share them.
Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, that first point is so important. I was just watching an interview with Dick Durbin. I'm from Illinois, and he was asking about whether like the tax increase is going to be enough for progressives in the suburbs, which is where I'm from. And I've been organizing online through the Progressive Working Class Association, and I don't actually think that my pages are clear or specific enough. And I mean, and it shows. And it's just so important, and to reach out to other organizations and really do your research on your positions and hammer that out before you post it.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. It's super important to do any research you can before you take to speaking on an issue, especially if you have a super large platform. I think it's super important to try and be as responsible as you can. by doing as much like background research and really trying to make the issue as accessible as possible to people. That is something we're going to talk about, and it goes really well with the specificity part, like what's the specific problem, and being able to explain that to people who maybe aren't in the organizing world. They're not in the politics world. They don't use the same language as us. Like, for example, one thing that I've had to really learn and focus on is when we're talking about organizing for the bills we're trying to pass and using the term like legislator. Like, that's not a super accessible term to some people. Like, they might not exactly know what that means or what their power is. So instead, transitioning to use the term lawmaker. Because while, yes, they aren't actually the ones like writing the laws, that's typically like organizers and people in the community. They're the ones that have a say if that law becomes a law. So just little things like that. And we'll kind of touch on that throughout this. But yeah, thanks for sharing that. Does anybody else have anything to add to this one? Sweet. Okay, we will move on then. So to kind of give everybody an example and walk through things so it's not super like vague and like theoretical, I'm going to use the example of our voting in jails bill. So voting in jails, first it started with just community organizing around an issue and developed into a bill, which later became a law. So the specific problem, Chicago votes and a number of community members and people who had experienced incarceration identified the problem. And the problem is people in jail, for the most part, the vast majority, are being held pre-trial and have the right to vote. And that's the case in Illinois and in many states across the US, like most states. But people that are detained were unable to vote because the polls are outside of the jail and they're in jail. And they face many barriers to registering to vote while in jail and then receiving their absentee ballot and successfully sending it out. So that's the problem that was identified. They then moved on to identifying who are the allies. They identified voting rights groups like League of Women Voters, Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, advocates for people experiencing incarceration. So then that brings in like the larger organizing world of people that tend to do like what's called criminal justice reform. Then you identify certain allies, like legislators that have maybe in the past taken a stance on issues that kind of align with this. They've shown that they care about expanding voting rights. They maybe care about people experiencing incarceration. So you kind of identify those people. And then other community organizations. So a lot of community organizations in different neighborhoods with predominantly Black community members or Latina community members are impacted by this issue. So they might be your allies. So that's the second step. Then the third step is who has the power to solve this problem? And in general, for this one, people that had the power, sheriffs. So sheriffs oversee jails. They have a lot of power over the culture of jails and ensuring that the jails are providing like absentee ballots or letting certain groups in to register people to vote. The governor also has a lot of power because the governor ultimately is the one that signs off on laws. And then legislators or lawmakers, because they're the ones that have to carry the policy through the House and then the Senate. And then you have other election officials that are in support. So in the case of Chicago, we had the Chicago Board of Elections, which was super helpful and in support of expanding and making sure voting was accessible to people in the jail. Then you say, how do I get to the people with power? You can reach out to them digitally, whether that be email, phone calls, and Twitter. You can apply pressure through their constituents. So with Chicago Votes, we have like advocacy evenings. So we have a ton of volunteers from all over Chicago, and they know who their lawmakers are who are supposed to be representing them. And then they can themselves reach out to their lawmaker, whether it be Twitter or calling them or emailing them and say, I care about this issue and you represent me, so you should care about this issue too. And then the fifth step is creating a plan of action. So you have to create a digital field plan. And a digital field plan is, what are you going to do on the internet, on social media, with press, to elevate this issue and mobilize people around it. So you have to identify your objectives, your timeline, metrics, so numbers or things you can use to understand if you're successfully reaching your goal, or if you have to like adjust your strategies. For voting in jails, you then have to come up with a policy plan, a communications plan, which really builds off the digital field plan. But communications focuses mostly on social media and then like press. And then the social media toolkit, which is something a ton of orgs use to make the issue accessible to people and easy for people to mobilize around. People are super busy and there's a lot of issues happening right now. So asking them to come up with like exactly the tweet that they want to send or create their own petition like is a lot of work for someone to do like after they've worked an 8-hour day. So social media toolkits are super helpful so people can take action in like 2 minutes. In the chat, Freya said, with reaching out to politicians, how do we mobilize people who may not be constituents of the area they're mobilizing in? Example, college students, etc. This is a super good question. And we can open this up for discussion because I know we have like a lot of organizers and stuff in this space. And I know specifically Alex and Brian have done organizing with college students. So how would you go about organizing people that aren't constituents per se?
I think what I would say is, if you are someone, and Freya, I'm not sure if you are a college student yourself, reaching out to politicians. Trying to find you.
Yeah, I myself am, and like I don't really have qualms about reaching out to like politicians, even if like I don't live in the area. But I know that like a lot of people are more hesitant because they feel like, you know, if they're already hesitant about like their voice being heard, not living like in the area of the politician they're trying to communicate with can be like kind of daunting.
Definitely. I think that the really one of the best ways to start is by making a social media toolkit. If you can have a document that has sample tweets for someone, maybe someone is more comfortable tweeting at a legislator instead of, you know, calling an office. If you give them a sample script and maybe it's something more general of like, you know, why are we targeting this politician? Is it for a specific purpose? So, you know, they can say things like, I'm an Illinois resident, and though an elected official in Illinois, like a state representative, is technically only representing a district of Illinois, they are representing the state of Illinois as a whole at the same time. So you as an Illinois resident, and if you're a college student in Illinois, you count as an Illinois resident and you can say that. And so you should definitely use that power. Did that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Kia also said, such a good question. A lot of those same tactics are applied to mobilizing teens and non-citizens. Yeah, so mobilizing people that maybe don't have the right to vote, so non-citizens, they still are residents. They're impacted by things and they still have the power to use their voice to voice something to a lawmaker. And when you're organizing digitally, especially whether it be sending tweets or calling, you don't have to say, hey, I'm not actually your constituent, but you should care about this issue. Like, you really don't have to say that. So you can really just voice your opinion and what they should do without saying that you aren't a constituent.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thanks. I usually just say something about like public pressure, but I think like if college students count as Illinois residents, even if like they aren't registered to vote in Illinois, like I think that's also good. So thank you.
Yeah.
And Twitter is definitely, and social media is a good space for that. Cause like with Twitter, you don't really have the space to say, hi, I'm a constituent, here's
Yeah,
my
exactly.
code, so you could do that as well.
All right, thanks.
Abby had another question. She said, when discussing using social, are you referring to solely organic? That's a super good question. So organic means you're not like paying for like social media attention or media attention. You're not like running ads or anything. So yeah, that is what I'm talking about for the most part. Later on in the training, I will talk about like press and other things, and we can talk about how to use how to like pay for attention as well to your advantage. But for the most part, we're talking about organic things just so it's accessible and it does not require like money to mobilize people digitally. Okay, now we will talk specifically about social media. So in the links I dropped, here, let me see. Okay, in the links I dropped, I hope everybody still has access to them, or else I will drop them again. But the first one is to this one, social media as a tool. And this will take you to an example of a document you can create to use social media to mobilize people. So this example specifically is the document Chicago Votes is currently using to advocate for the bills we're trying to pass. And this document is super long, but it didn't start off this long. It's just kind of grown throughout time. And it really takes all the information you need for all the bills and everything we're trying to pass, who's your allies and how to contact them and everything, and puts them in one spot. So an example, so we have a link here to a legislative tracker. So this is super example when you're trying to pass laws is super important, is because this spreadsheet right here will open up and it will have the names of every single senator and every single representative in Illinois. It will have their in-district office, their Springfield office, their phone number, their Twitter handle, and their email. So that's super, super easy for people to just go in the spreadsheet and be like, okay, I need to contact Representative Burke. So I'm going to look at his phone number, and it's super easy rather than trying to Google everything at the moment you need it. Then we have different toolkits for specific things. So like when you're passing bills, you have to collect witness slips. And those are basically government petitions showing support for a bill. And that's like rapid fire advocacy you have to do because you only have like usually about 72 hours to collect as many slips as possible. So this is an example of creating something super quickly because you have to mobilize people within like 3 days, usually at most. So you give here's an example Twitter and Facebook post people can post. And then here's a photo. And then also a link to a photo library so people can easily access them. And then here's an email script. People can send it via email. And here's a text. So this document has 3 different ways people can take action around this one bill. And all of this probably takes about 2 minutes for someone to do. So this is an example of creating a social media toolkit so that people can't so quickly ignore your ask of them because you did the work for them. So we have tons of those. We have tons of like different information and stats so people can feel creative in creating their own language around an issue. And then the vast majority of this is just like copy and paste tweets people can use. So there is a ton of different language out there, but people don't have to come up with it themselves. So this is an example that you guys will have access to kind of help you if you ever have an issue you're trying to organize around on social media. This is an example of a toolkit. Do people have questions about this? Sweet. Okay. Then back to the slides. So social media is helpful in a ton of ways. It's also harmful, but in terms of it being helpful, social media is great for public education because in order to mobilize people, people have to understand the issue and care about it. And caring about it is the key there, because people can really understand an issue and like know the data behind an issue and still really not care if there's not like a face behind the issue or an actual story behind the issue. So that's where storytelling comes in. Stories are super powerful. They connect with people who you can connect anybody through stories if you really sit down and and are vulnerable with people. So using storytelling is super helpful. Recently, the Coalition to End Money Bond, they did an amazing job with storytelling in their digital campaign. They had video clips of directly impacted people who were held in jail simply because they could not afford to pay their bail. And they just sat on the camera and explained how that impacted their life. And when you hear that and you see the faces, that makes the statistics and the facts behind it come alive and make it relevant to people and make people care. So that is something to use in social media, whether it be photos, quotes from directly impacted people. Videos are super powerful. Those are all things to share on social media. They also help you build a base because you need people in order for a movement to happen and for people to move around an issue. So social media allows you to build a base. Once people are passionate, they want updates and they want ways to plug in. And then it's also helpful for direct action. So the document I showed you, the social media tool, that's a form of direct action because you're tweeting directly and taking action directly to reach out to someone and organizing around an issue. So direct action looks like so many different things. It's like protesting in the streets, but it's also tweeting to a lawmaker, calling a lawmaker, asking your friends to sign a petition. That is direct action. Do people have any questions about social media specifically? Sweet. Okay. So the next thing that you do when you're trying to have a campaign or organize around an issue is you have to develop your messaging. So that comes back to the first point of the arc of digital organizing, which is defining or identifying your specific problem. So anybody can just name a problem that people are starting to care about, or a problem that's in the news a lot. Okay, voting rights. Great example. Voting rights, super broad issue. And there's so many different aspects of it. So an organization could be saying that they're fighting for voting rights. But they're specifically, maybe the specific issue is same day voter registration. So they want people to be able to register to vote on the same day that they vote. That means your messaging has to revolve around that and kind of make that language as accessible as possible to people. So in your messaging, you have to define the problem and explain the solution. So all of these things that are bullet points here are things to consider when developing your messaging. So what is your objective or goal? I see that Kia also dropped police brutality as an issue. So what's the objective or goal? Right now, defund the police is a big thing. That's narrative change. That's also mobilization, and that's public education. So that one is a lot, but defund the police narrative change. The narrative is what is public safety, and how can we change our understanding of public safety and our response to it as a society. So that's the narrative you're kind of going around. You're also going around, what are we funding as a society that isn't helping us and keeping us safe, and what could we be funding? Then there's the mobilization. So if you want to mobilize people around your message, cops out of CPS is an example. Students showed up to the school board meetings, they showed up to city council meetings. So the messaging, if they wanted to mobilize people, would have to be specific around mobilization. Your messaging would have to include, this is when the next city council meeting is. This is who your elected school board is. So that's something to consider. For public education, for example, if it's around defunding the police, a huge part of public education is, how much are we funding the police? And then you also want to show like how police funding has increased, and then crime also hasn't like decreased at the same time. So clearly increasing police funding is not making us safer. So those are some things to really think about. You really want to figure out what the goal of your organizing is, and then frame your messaging around that. You also have to understand what the common beliefs or perceptions around the issue are. Is it lack of information or knowledge on the issue? Is it an abundance of misinformation? Or is it knowledge without action? So we're all super aware of the issue, but no one's really addressing it. So it depends on the issue you're trying to tackle, but those are some things you have to consider. Then the next thing is, what message will resonate with my target audience? And the key here is target audience. So if you're trying to talk to a lawmaker, your audience is going to be a lawmaker or lawmakers in general. If your audience is young Black and brown people, then your messaging should align with what young Black and brown people tend to like, the language used, and making sure the language is accessible to them. So things to consider. What is the tone? Are you, like when you're framing your messaging, are you saying, I demand you do this? I urge you to do this. I would greatly appreciate if you do this. Like all of those different things really change how people perceive or like react to what you're asking. So in certain instances, you might have to like play respectability politics a little bit, and like not automatically be like, I demand you defund the police. But in other instances, like that might be what you need to do. So that's something to consider. Also, I mentioned this again, accessibility and digestibility of your message. If you're using like super academic language, or language that's like really inaccessible to people that haven't had a huge background in this issue, like your message and your movement is not going to go as far. You want to make sure what you're saying is easy to understand. You also want to make sure it's digestible. So with any single issue, like anybody mentioned in the chat, like rent control, police brutality, voting rights, mental health, things like that, there's so much information on those issues. There's so much dialogue and rhetoric around these issues, and you can't talk about everything at once because it's overwhelming to people. So you have to like make it as simple and digestible as possible for people. You then want to figure out what platform you're going to try and reach people on. If you're organizing, depending on who your target audience is, for young people, target audience, you might focus on Twitter, Instagram. For older people, for retirees, you might turn to Facebook, and then also consider not solely relying on social media if you're trying to reach an older audience. So phones, like they tend to like answer their phones more than young people. So that's something, like phone calls. Email is something, if you're trying to reach out to lawmakers or labor organizing, email might be helpful. And then you want to consider assumptions about prior knowledge. You don't want to assume people are experts. Like, you don't want to assume people know everything about an issue, but you also don't want to assume they don't know anything about an issue, because then you're kind of like, that's problematic. So you want to try and find like a nice middle ground. And then this document here, which I'm opening up, is an example of developing messaging. So this is specifically for a Chicago votes bill. We're trying to pass the bill, End Prison Slave Labor, Senate Bill 649. And this bill it's pretty provocative in its name, End Prison Slave Labor. And it's hard for people to digest. So you want to make your messaging tight. So we developed a messaging guide. So we have certain points that we really try and get across when talking to people about this issue. First point, justifying slavery by any means is still justifying slavery. Like, that's like a super easy thing to remember and say to people. And then you can back it up with further things. Like, the Constitution explicitly says it's slavery, so us calling it slavery is not a stretch. And then it just keeps going, and there's like 4 points here that help people understand the issue. And this would be like an internal document. Like, you wouldn't like post this on Twitter and be like, now do something about it. But it helps you kind of develop like your tweets, for example. Do people have questions about messaging? Sweet. Okay.
Steven, did you have a question?
These are all in the links, right?
This messaging guide isn't, but the other ones are.
Okay.
I can also, if it's helpful, I can email this slide deck out to people afterwards if they want this information.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah. So everything we just talked about, the reason that everything we just talked about is super important is because organizing, like digital organizing, is not just posting on social media. So when you're just posting on social media, like, you can say whatever you want and not put much thought into it. And people are probably not going to organize around it. Like, they'll be like, oh, that's a cool thing to learn, but I'm not, like, what am I going to do about it now? So that's what differs from digital organizing, because the goal is to mobilize people. So things you have to do to make it easy for people to take action. People have to have an understanding of the problem. People have to care about the problem. There has to be an identified solution to the problem. This is key. This is super, super important. There are tons of issues. Everybody's overwhelmed. And a lot of people kind of feel hopeless and are like, well, what's the point in taking action if nothing's going to change or there isn't a solution? Like, you're just talking a lot about problems and complaining. So you have to explain, like, there are solutions to these problems, and you have to kind of break that down to people. And then people also have to be given resources to advocate for the solution. So that's like a social media toolkit, access to like educational materials if they want to further learn about an issue. So this kind of just breaks down the steps to mobilizing people digitally. Other things to consider. So this kind of touches on the organic piece of it. So this is still like, even when you're working with press, for the most part, that's organic unless you're paying for ads in newspapers or things like that. So depending on the issue and how comfortable you are with working with the press can help you, or it can work to your advantage, or it cannot, basically. But press releases are a super helpful way to get media attention around an issue, get media to show up to a direct action, and get coverage. So a lot of people don't know like how to write a press release, and they're super intimidated by it, but it's actually pretty simple. And Rachel Perota, who is absolutely amazing. She's in Chicago and she helps like nonprofits and organizers get media attention. She worked with Good Kids Mad City to create this how to write a press release document. And this is one of the links you all will have. So this intro is helpful, but she gives a lot of examples of press releases and she explains the different types. So this is like a simple straight to the point press release: when, where, who, what, why. Then you also have, and she explains it here. So definitely encourage you guys to like save this and like notebook it if you ever want to write press releases. But then there's narrative press releases. So these are more like written like articles. And they have the same information as the like who, what, where, when, why press release. It's just kind of more narrative. But aspects of press releases. So the intro, well, first we'll start up here. You want to have like your contact information. So this is Good Kids Mad City. They have their Twitter, they have their Facebook. Then you always say press release and you always say for immediate release, and you say the day you're going to release it. The day you're going to release the press release is not necessarily the day of the event that you are trying to raise attention about. You then put your press contact, so the person that the media can email or ask for interviews or speak to at the direct action. And then you put your own little title. And sometimes news outlets copy and paste the title and use it directly, or they don't, but it kind of briefly explains the event. Then the first paragraph condenses who, what, where, when, why. So, Chicago, Saturday, November 24th, 4 p.m. on King Drive. They're demanding a ceasefire. So you now know what the event is. Also note the event is the 24th. It says for immediate release November 22nd. So that means they sent out this press release ahead of time, and then they probably sent it out every morning until the event. So as much media saw it as possible. You then include a little bit of more information about the what. And then you always include a quote. It could be a quote from a leader in your organization, a directly impacted person, someone who organized the event. And then your last paragraph is just a general paragraph about you or your organization. Like for Chicago Votes, we always say we're a nonpartisan nonprofit, and then we just like explain in general what we do. And then you always end with these 3 hashtags or pound signs, and that lets the press know that that is the end of the press release. So anything after that is not the press release. So you all will have access to this, but yeah, that is a press release. And in terms of sending it out, you would want to make a media list or pay attention to people that might cover this issue. So that brings us to building relationships with the media. So you can get access to media lists. For like Chicago, for example, you could get a list of all the different news stations and their emails, so that you just email it to them. But you can also build your own media list by keeping track of writers and news outlets covering issues that align with yours. And then building relationships with people on primarily Twitter, journalists specifically, so that when you have a pitch or a press release, they're more likely to pay attention to it because they kind of are familiar with you. So as far as keeping track of writers and outlets, if you want, you can make a spreadsheet. And when you're reading the news, if you see an article that's okay, they did a really good job covering this issue, take the name of the writer down and their email. And then when you have a press release, you can send it to them because you trust that they're going to cover the issue well. As far as social media to build relationships, journalists and reporters are all over Twitter all day, every day. and they're always constantly sharing like their latest article or their piece. So retweet their pieces, DM them and be like, you did a super, like, I loved your coverage of this. I'm working on a similar issue. Would you be interested in talking about this issue? That's something you can do because they love that, and it makes their job easier because they're always trying to find stories. So giving them stories, like, they love that. But I have a question that we can all discuss as a group. What are some things that you should consider when working with the press? It's kind of a broad question, so it can take us wherever we want, but this is just an important question to ask. Anyone have any ideas on things you should consider when working with the press? Steven, did you have something?
I don't have too much experience with the press, so I'm reflecting on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can kind of kick us off. So some things to consider when you're writing a press release and you send it out, you can't guarantee how they're going to cover your story. So that's why it's super important to kind of make a list of reporters you trust and news outlets you trust, because you don't want to have an issue super close to your heart and get news coverage, but they don't cover it well, or they like cover it really in a problematic way. So that is something to consider when you are working with the press. You're working with the press, so they're not going to promise that they're going to cover the story exactly how you would want it covered. And that's the main thing to take away from it, is that it will not be exactly how you would write it if you could write the article yourself.
There's some stuff in the chat too, Katrina.
Oh, sweet. Yeah. They don't always have your best interest in mind necessarily. Super true. And their messaging might not always reflect yours. Super true. Also, when news cycles run and your story might not get covered. I will expand on all of these. So these are all super, super important. So they don't always have your best interest in mind. Yeah. So like, as someone who's trying to pass a bill, my goal is to get my bill passed, but the journalist is just trying to talk about the issue. So they're not necessarily there to help you get your bill passed. So that is something to consider. Their messaging might not always reflect yours. True. And also the language they use might not always align with the language you prefer. For example, at Chicago Votes, we use people first language. So we never refer to people as felon, criminal, like convict, like those terms. We always say person experiencing incarceration, formerly incarcerated person. But when we talk to the media, a lot of times they cover our issues and use those oppressive terms. So I've had to get more comfortable saying, like, explicitly saying in the interview, like, I will use the term like people first language, and I would really appreciate it if you would too, when quoting me and when talking about your article. So that is something like they might not do it anyways, but it's just something to get across if you can. And then when news cycles run to get your story covered, also important. For direct action specifically, like we had, I was a part of one this morning, and it was at 11 a.m. and the news coverage would be at 11:30. So they emailed me asking, can I speak to you at 10:30 a.m. so we can prepare it ahead of time? So that was super nice, and they might not always do that, but like another direct action I was at, it was like a very similar direct action, and the media was there, but at the exact same time, news came out that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was causing blood clots. So that took up all the media attention. So the press came to our event, but they didn't end up covering it because the media was saturated with other stuff. So those are some things to consider. Other helpful tools that aren't social media per se are online petitions. There's a number of platforms to create online petitions and they're free, so don't pay for it unless you feel like you really have to. But Move On is one. We're using Move On. There's Color of Change, and like super popular is change.org. So those are ways to make petitions. You can also make automated emails. So specifically when reaching out to lawmakers, you can make an Action Network account, which is also free. And you type in the email you want sent to all the lawmakers. And then you can email that link to people and they just have to put in their address and it pulls up their lawmaker's email and automatically sends that email to them. So those are tools you can use and they're free. But a question is, why are petitions useful? Anyone can feel free to answer this. Or maybe like, what petitions have you seen or you signed and around what issues? An easy way to get involved. They get people informed, engaged in the conversation, bring awareness to an issue. Yes, these are all true. Super true. So depending on the issue you're organizing around or your target, the person who has the power to address the issue, depends on how you would use a petition. So petitions are super helpful in just showing that people care about an issue. So if you're like, when I was in college, we would have petitions circulating campus all the time to bring to the school administration, be like, look, students actually care. Like this many students said they care about this issue. And that kind of pressures them to then take that issue seriously. One second, sorry. Alex, can you explain why we use petitions and how they relate to witness slips?
Hey, this is through Kia, but yes, I can talk about witness slips. So we use our petition, like Katrina said, a witness slip. Can y'all just like do like a thumbs up or in the chat, just say yes if you've ever filled out a witness slip or you even know, like you've heard that term before. We got a nope, we got a yes, we got a couple thumbs up, some more no's. So a witness slip, just like Katrina said before, is basically a government petition. It's a petition specifically for the government. So, you know, we can get a petition, we can start our own one like we did on Move On, and we can have all of y'all sign it, but there's really no guarantee that a legislator is even gonna look at this petition, he's even gonna know what's going on unless we like physically print them out and bring them to the legislator's desk. So in Illinois, when we're trying to pass laws, we have something called witness slips. And that is just a specifically on the government's website to sign on to an individual bill in support or against a bill. As a community member, any of us can file a witness slip here. And so we use this petition anytime that we made on Move On to collect really as many people and mobilize as many people and just start that education process of like, what is the specific problems that we are trying to fix, to start just getting folks in the mix with us. So that way, when we have access to those government petitions, because like Katrina said, they're usually only open for like a maximum of 3 days to get as many people as you possibly can. We have already been doing the work with this petition on Move On. And we can just send all of them one email and say, please sign this witness slip, because we know that you've already care about this issue. You've been getting notices from us. You've signed on to these bills. So this petition makes our life easier so we can translate these numbers, that 1,081 number, to our witness slips. So that way, when our bill is being heard in committee in front of legislators and they're like, wow, they have over 300 people, 400, 700, 1,000 people that care about this bill. And that is what goes directly in front of legislators' faces. So that's a real digital organizing technique that unfortunately, most Illinois residents just have no idea what that is, but it's so incredibly powerful.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. Do people have questions or want to talk about like how to use petitions or how to start a petition or how to share a petition, things like that? Sweet. So one thing is you can create your petition, and then you can also create a social media toolkit for your petition, asking people to text it out or tweet it out as well. So all these different tools and things work in tandem to really like mobilize people. Okay, it is now 4 o'clock. Perfect. And I want to give people time to like practice or like use this information so it's not so like abstract. So if you open up the last link that was in the chat, I will drop it again. Oh, it's echoing. It's a social media plan template. And this is a document, it's blank for you all to use. You can't edit directly on it, so you have to make a copy of it. But this is a document that can help you when you're trying to create your communications plan and your digital organizing or your digital field plan. So we can kind of go through it together and like do different examples of different issues we all care about. But this document breaks down the purpose. So why are you posting on social media? What is your goal, basically? And then specifically, like, what is your goal? Like, what do you hope to accomplish? Strategy, how will you achieve this goal? Success, like what success looks like. So this is where maybe metrics come in. And then key messaging. So you would break down some of the points you're trying to make, the details of that point, and then how you can really drive that point home. Then you want to try and figure out who is your target audience. So here you would just like break down like who your target audience is, and that will help you decide your strategies for reaching your audience and some of the platforms you might use. And then like a social media calendar. So this can help you organize so you're not super overwhelmed. You can plan things out ahead of time if you have an understanding of the timeline you're working with. So if everybody has access to this and stuff, we can kind of just work through it as a group and figure out like what different problems and issues people care about right now and kind of help each other brainstorm and talk through this document if people want. So I will stop sharing my screen. Does anybody here have like an issue or something that they really care about? It doesn't have to be something you've like organized around before, but something maybe you want to start organizing around.
I'd like to start organizing a little bit more effectively around food insecurity. Oh,
That's a great one. So then you would figure out like what's your purpose? Do you want people do you want to pass policy around this? Do you want to educate people about this? Do you want to target maybe like if food deserts is the issue, like how do you want to go about that? So what specifically is the purpose? that you're trying to figure out?
So in Central America, there's there's a crisis there, and we have refugees coming from there because of the collapsing food system
Mhm.
there. So yeah, I'd like to address that.
Address that, yeah. So like there's a ton of ways you could go about that. You could go about that on like a federal policy way if you're into that. But because it's an issue like in another country, you might not feel comfortable having the US government get involved. So you could try and organize with like nonprofits, non-governmental organizations. So you kind of have to figure out like what route you're going to take on that. So you can decide your messaging. You could try and organize like immigrant communities around the issue. You could try and organize super privileged communities around it, and try and get them to take action. So that would kind of impact your purpose. And then you would have to figure out what your goal is. And that's like a super huge issue. So you would probably try and figure out, break down different goals you have within that. Do you have any like goals or like your dream for like how to fix the issue off the top of your head?
So the situation down there is only going to get worse as time goes on. So I mean, we're not going to stop seeing refugees who are fleeing those conditions. We can provide support along the way, but ultimately, I think offering them refuge and food security here in the United States has to be part of the solution.
Okay, sweet. So that's a goal. So then you're going to talk about like immigration policy. That could be a goal, maybe passing a bill around that. You could do maybe narrative change is a goal. So you want people to understand the stories and the experiences of people who have experienced this. So it's harder for opposition to like criminalize and demonize people who are trying to come. So that could be a goal. You could also have like a simple goal of meeting with your Illinois congressperson to talk about this issue with them. Like that could be a goal. So those are different goals, and then you would figure out some strategies for that. So if you're trying to meet with your congressperson, like a strategy, like first you might just try and email them. You're probably not going to get a response the first time, so you probably want to call them. And then if that doesn't work, you would probably tweet at them until they pay attention to you. So there's strategies you can take. So that would be a strategy, and you can use like social media and like other digital platforms for that. And then you would want to figure out your key messaging. So depending on your audience or your target, messaging might have to include some educational aspects about it, like what is causing this migration? How is the climate crisis contributing to this? How has the US's involvement in other countries contributed to this, and things like that. So you would try and break that down and make it accessible to people who maybe don't have a super strong understanding of the issue already. Or if your audience is people who do have a super strong understanding, then that would be fine.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hannah, I think you were going to say something before too. We can like talk through that one too.
I'm trying to remember. Well, actually, I'm currently organizing around something that we can use as an example to talk through. So I am a volunteer with the ACLU of San Diego and Imperial counties. So I'm not local to Chicago. I'm out here in San Diego, but right now we're working on a local ordinance that's called Protect, and it would essentially prevent pretext stops and with traffic stops. It's basically a measure to improve policing accountability in the city here. So that's something we're working on. Truthfully, I haven't really posted about it too much on social media. really am just working through the organization through my volunteer time. So yeah, we can talk through that.
Yeah, that's awesome. And other people can feel free to like jump into this convo if you have ideas as well. But it sounds like you you have identified your problem and made it specific and kind of identified a solution already. So that's super helpful when it comes to developing messaging and things like that. Do people on this call, any other people have ideas for how to kind of break down like the digital aspect of this? You said it's a city ordinance?
Yeah, yep, for the San Diego City.
So that would help you identify targets. It would be like city council and then also like constituents that can help pressure people in those positions. Do other people have ideas?
I wonder, the different types of public education you can do through social media. I think sometimes people are scared to post on their social media about issues that may be controversial because, they don't know who's on their Facebook, Twitter, who's watching that. But there's definitely ways to just be very educational on social media and just start saying things like, I'm volunteering for, fighting for this ordinance and this is what it's doing. If you want to learn more, happy to talk with anybody. Sometimes I use Twitter a lot through our advocacy evenings with all of the wonderful tweets that Katrina has drafted for me and other volunteers that join us. And most of those tweets are educationally based, right? They're not just like, this needs to happen now. They're mostly education. They're mostly statistics, narrative that really sway people. And those are the tweets that get most traction on social media, are the ones that have like, this is the percentage of people that are mothers in prison. This is the percentage of people that are veterans in prison. We need people in prison to have the right to vote. And people will really vibe with that. Just thinking through, how to use social media and, maybe break that. It's definitely not a new thing, but at the same time, I feel like how to use social media to directly influence lawmakers and elected officials is something that needs to happen more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. No, those are great points. Candidly for me, I think that there's more of an opportunity to post on social media. And I really like what you said about using different data points and statistics to enforce that, because actually the ordinance has been developed based on all of the data that the San Diego Police Department actually collected from their own officers. And it's very damning. And there's a lot of information there that I think a lot of local people and constituents don't even know about. So that's a really good point. Thank you.
Yeah, another thing, because people in the chat are dropping some like super helpful things as well, but something to think about is once you have like a strong understanding of like a timeline or like the like city council timeline, you can make a toolkit specifically for people signing up to speak at council meetings and give testimony, because that's super powerful. You can we help people that might not feel they don't know how to testify in front of like the Senate, for example. So like really helping people and walking them through and being like, your experience is super valid and you're an expert in that. So like I'm here to help you share that. That is something that requires digital organizing, is being like, you could also tweet, like have a tweet campaign, like the next city council meeting is here, log in here to watch it, log in here to sign up to have testimony. Like all of that is organizing because you're helping people mobilize around an issue. I know Kia and Abby in the chat are talking about celebrity engagement. That's also super, like I didn't touch on that at all in this, but that has been super helpful for Chicago Votes. And like so many organizations is finding like a celebrity, someone has a super large platform that you trust to help uplift the issue. And with that, it's super important to just note like directly impacted people are the experts, and their narrative and stories should be at the forefront. But people with huge platforms can also like use their platform to uplift other people's experiences. So there's a number of different like celebrities that like are trying to help and like be more socially justice aware. So like trying to reach out to them, figuring out who like their PR people are. Usually that's the point of contact, is their PR people, and working with them to help uplift something. And also like writing the script or writing the tweet that you want them to send so that they stay on with your messaging. You probably know more about the issue than the celebrity, I'm guessing. So
Yeah, oh, that makes sense. Thank you.
do other people have we have like 15 minutes left, but we can definitely end early. But if we can just use this space to talk more about things, if people have specific questions or anything, feel free to speak up.
Aaron, I saw you put treatment, not trauma, that campaign in the chat.
Yes, I did.
Yeah, so are you organizing around that right now, or are you just hoping to get involved in it?
I'm currently organizing with it. I've been working with a couple of orgs to get people on board through phone banking, so calling community members directly and telling them to call their alderman to support more funding for treatment, not trauma. Also, just like phone banking to get people informed about it, but mostly just like outreach to the community.
Yeah, that's awesome. Phone banking, that's another aspect of digital organizing. Um, phone banking is super helpful. Abby, you have your hand raised. Text banking is also great too. And there's a number of different like apps and things. A lot of them you have to pay for, but that help like generate things to reach more people, specifically with texting.
So I have a question about digital organizing for newly developed like organizations. I think when we look at a lot of these like this plan that we've gone over, it's definitely for brands that have already been very well trusted, like maybe in the Chicago area, like Chicago Votes. But if you're very new to organizing and you want to put out this type of messaging, how do you develop like a trustworthy brand that people can trust? And, you know, yeah.
Yeah, that's a super good question. Trustworthiness, I think people have to know who you are as an organization. If they don't know like faces, then it's hard to kind of trust people. So making sure people know like who are the organizers in your organization and what is their background. Chicago Votes, we post on social media all the time when we have like a new hire. And we are constantly trying to keep people updated about like our staff, so people like understand the people behind the work. That helps with trustworthiness. Alex is dropping stuff in the chat. Consistency. So posting consistently shows that you're like not like a troll. Like you, like this is what your mission is and your goal. Transparency about how you're fighting for it. That's huge. Also, like if you're doing like public education, which is always a part of your organizing to some extent, including sources about data. So people can go back and verify things. That is super important. And then, or like being in community with other organizations that maybe have already developed their trustworthiness and have been in the area and doing similar work, and being in community with them, because that can help you also build community, expand your reach, and also people will trust you if they know another organization they already trust also trusts you. Josh said Chicago Votes repost news as well that people generally see. Yeah, reposting news. So it's not like you're the source, like you're just sharing information that has already been fact checked and things like that. You asked if Twitter verification is important. I don't think it is. That's my personal opinion. Chicago Votes was only just verified like 2 months ago, and we were still able to accomplish a ton like in the 8 years previous. So I don't think it's super important. But the amount of followers you have and your reach is important. So you want to be able to make sure that your message is reaching as many people as possible. So increasing your followers, asking people to reshare your content so it's reaching as many people as possible is important. But I don't really think the verification badge is really going to be the make or break for a campaign success.
I'll also say, like, Abby, it really depends on what the campaign is. Like, are you starting a nonprofit that you hope to grow for 3 to 5, 10 years? If so, you should definitely develop all of the social medias and start organically growing. Is this a campaign that you need something done in 2 weeks? Like, I need to mobilize around this like crazy. Maybe you just hit Twitter and you just start, you and the people around you start a Twitter storm to really start getting a bunch of noise quicker, and you're really tagging a bunch of people to get them in the conversation. Maybe you're phone banking as well. And I will say what makes you trustworthy is the people that you're organizing with. If it's clear that it's just you, no one's going to join it because you need people to organize well. And
Yeah.
that's what builds trust.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, just going off of that, I think it's super important for people to know that like the people leading the work in your organization have been impacted and aren't just like people from the outside coming in. So that's just super important in all aspects of organizing, but in digital organizing, as far as building trust, it's really important too. All right. If people don't have anything else, I'm happy to email this slide to people if people want it. If you want it, just drop your email in the chat. I think that's the easiest way. And I can email you the slide deck and then all the documents that I had linked into the chat as well.
I was gonna just say last thing to you, Erin, for treatment on trauma, because I was trying to help with that organizing as well in last year's budget. And my alderman is Alderman Kappelman, and like me and several other constituents like met with him several times, and like he will talk all the time about how much he cares about the homeless population, LGBTQ people, mental health, and how the police officers don't actually know how to treat people that are going through a mental health crisis. And so he'll be like, oh yeah, treatment on trauma. Oh, it's so great all the time. And then he'll just vote no on it, and he'll just vote yes on the budget. And so his actions completely are opposite to what he's telling constituents. And so you can use I use digital organizing to first connect with other constituents, right? Then we emailed and we found his office hours to get in front of him. And then what we should have done afterward is we should have used Twitter to hold him accountable, and to have said like we all met with him, Kappelman, because he is very active on Twitter. And so we should have really put a lot of pressure, we probably still can, to say like, Alderman Kappelman, to the world, this is a public tweet. He is lying to his constituents. He doesn't actually care for him to feel the pressure of going against what he's saying to his own constituents. So really using it for that whole process.
Yeah, I definitely saw that with another alderman, and that's really good to know, just for like strategies and just like moving forward too. Because when we were calling constituents of Alderman Sawyer's ward, he was telling people that he wasn't like the head of the health committee, like he had no say in it. And it's like he obviously could bring up any legislation or ordinance to the floor to talk about it. And I think you hit on a really good point. It's so important to keep a lot of these elected officials accountable, because in the end, like, their constituents are the ones that vote for them.
And they are up for election in 2023. And
Yep.
they need to know that they could get fired. And I think many of them really need that threat.
Yes, definitely.
Awesome. Well, I hope you all walked away with something at least. And you all have those documents, so use them. And you can always reach out to me if you have questions about anything or want to like talk one-on-one or anything. My email is katrina@chicagovotes.com. I'll drop it in the chat. You can also like DM Chicago Votes on social media, because it's most likely going to be me that sees it and will respond. But yeah, thank you all so much for coming out to this. This will also be on YouTube, on Chicago Votes' YouTube, if you want to like look back on it. So yeah, thank you so much. Have a good weekend, everybody.
Thanks, y'all. Bye.